The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked asphalt of the grocery store parking lot in downtown Atlanta. Heat waves shimmered in the distance, creating an almost dreamlike distortion of the bustling commercial district. Cars moved in slow, lazy patterns as shoppers navigated between the endless rows of vehicles, their air conditioners working overtime against the oppressive Georgia humidity. In the far corner of the lot, near the shade of an old oak tree, sat a pristine black Cadillac Escalade. The vehicle gleamed under the filtered sunlight, its chrome accents catching the light like jewels. The windows were tinted just dark enough to provide privacy while remaining within legal limits, and the license plate read simply DS01 in elegant lettering. Behind the wheel sat Denise Sterling, though at first glance most would see only what they expected to see. Her rich brown skin had a natural glow even in the artificial light filtering through the windshield. Her hair was styled in a professional twist, not a strand out of place despite the heat. She wore a simple but elegant navy blazer over a crisp white blouse, the kind of understated luxury that spoke of both success and restraint. Denise's fingers moved gracefully across the screen of her phone as she responded to a series of urgent text messages. The messages weren't about shopping lists or weekend plans. They were about committee hearings, budget allocations, and the kind of political maneuvering that most people only read about in newspapers. But to the casual observer glancing through her windshield, she was just another shopper taking a moment to check her phone. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, Senator Denise Sterling, one of the most powerful women in Georgia politics, sitting in a parking lot where she was about to become just another statistic. But she didn't know that yet. For now, she was simply trying to coordinate her schedule between a lunch meeting with education lobbyists and an afternoon committee hearing on police reform. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call from her chief of staff. She glanced at the caller ID and was about to answer when movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention. Through the windshield, she could see a police cruiser moving slowly through the parking lot, its occupants scanning the vehicles with the methodical attention of a predator surveying its territory. Officer Randy Collins sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, his pale complexion already showing signs of sunburn despite the early hour. His sandy brown hair was cut in the regulation style, and his uniform was pressed to perfection, every badge and button polished to a mirror shine. But there was something in his eyes, a hardness that spoke of years of resentment and barely contained frustration that made his professional appearance seem more like a costume than a calling. Collins had been patrolling this beat for 8 years, watching as the neighborhood slowly changed around him. New businesses moved in, property values rose, and the demographics shifted in ways that made him uncomfortable. He'd grown up in a different Atlanta, one where lines were clearer and expectations were simpler. This new world, where he couldn't always tell at a glance who belonged and who didn't, left him feeling displaced and angry. His radio crackled to life with routine traffic updates, but Collins wasn't really listening. His attention was focused on the expensive vehicles scattered throughout the lot. Mercedes, BMWs, Audis, and there, in the corner, that massive Escalade. His jaw tightened as he took in the scene. In his mind, expensive cars in this area during business hours usually meant one of two things: drug dealers or people who didn't belong here. The Escalade's windows were tinted, which immediately raised his suspicions. In Collins' experience, people who had nothing to hide didn't need to hide behind dark glass. He'd made this assumption countless times before, and it had served him well in his own estimation. The fact that he'd been wrong more often than right never seemed to register in his memory. Collins pulled his cruiser into a parking space 2 rows away from the Escalade, positioning himself so he could observe without being too obvious. He reached for his binoculars, a habit he'd developed over the years despite department policies discouraging such surveillance without probable cause. Through the lenses, he could make out a figure in the driver's seat, apparently focused on a phone. "Probably coordinating a deal," he muttered to himself. the words barely audible in the confines of his patrol car. It was a narrative he'd constructed hundreds of times before, a story that justified whatever actions he was about to take. The details always changed, but the basic plot remained the same. A suspicious person in an expensive car equals criminal activity. Collins observed for another 10 minutes, his imagination filling in the blanks with scenarios that grew more elaborate with each passing moment. When Denise finally stepped out of her vehicle to retrieve something from the back seat, Collins felt his pulse quicken. This was his moment, his chance to make what he was certain would be a significant arrest. Denise had no idea she was being watched as she walked around to the rear of her Escalade. She was dressed impeccably, every detail of her appearance carefully considered. The blazer was tailored to perfection, the blouse was silk, and her shoes were Italian leather. She carried herself with the confident posture of someone accustomed to respect, someone used to walking into rooms where her presence changed the dynamic. She opened the back of the SUV and retrieved a briefcase, the same burgundy leather case she'd carried for the past 5 years. Inside were documents that could influence millions of dollars in state funding, committee reports that would shape policy for years to come, and draft legislation that bore her signature. But Collins saw none of that complexity. All he saw was a black woman with an expensive car, and in his narrow worldview, that equation always led to the same conclusion. Collins started his engine and began moving toward the Escalade, his movements deliberate and predatory. He'd done this dance so many times before that it had become almost automatic. Approach with confidence, establish dominance, and create a narrative that justified whatever escalation might follow. The script was always the same, even if the actors changed. Denise was closing the back of her vehicle when she noticed the patrol car approaching. She felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she'd experienced countless times throughout her life whenever law enforcement appeared in her vicinity. It was a feeling that success, education, and political power had never quite managed to erase. She straightened her shoulders and prepared for what she hoped would be a routine encounter. Collins pulled up directly behind the Escalade, positioning his cruiser so that it would be impossible for the SUV to back out. It was an intimidation tactic he'd perfected over the years, a way of immediately establishing that this wasn't a friendly conversation. He took his time getting out of the patrol car, letting the weight of the moment build as he adjusted his utility belt and checked his radio. The parking lot, which had been bustling with activity just moments before, seemed to grow quieter as other shoppers sensed the tension building in the corner near the oak tree. Some stopped to observe from a distance, their phones already in hand, while others hurried past with their eyes averted. Everyone recognized the choreography of what was about to unfold, even if they couldn't predict exactly how it would end. Collins approached the Escalade with the swagger of a man who believed he held all the cards. His hand rested casually on his service weapon, not as a direct threat but as a reminder of the power differential at play. His pale blue eyes were hidden behind mirrored sunglasses that reflected Denise's composed face as she turned to face him. "Good afternoon, officer," Denise said, her voice clear and professional. Years of public speaking had taught her how to project calm authority even in stressful situations. "Is there something I can help you with?" Collins bristled at her tone. In his experience, people who spoke with such confidence usually had something to hide. Legitimate citizens were supposed to be nervous, deferential, apologetic. This woman's composure felt like a challenge to his authority, and he didn't like being challenged. "I need to see your license and registration," Collins said, his voice carrying the flat, commanding tone he'd perfected during his years on the force. He didn't explain why he needed these documents, didn't cite any traffic violation or suspicious behavior. In his mind, his badge was explanation enough. Denise felt her pulse quicken, but her expression remained serene. She'd been through scenarios like this before, though never while carrying her current level of political influence. "Certainly, officer," she said, reaching slowly into her purse. "May I ask what this is regarding?" "Just routine," Collins replied, though nothing about this encounter was routine. "Nice car," How'd you afford something like this? The question hung in the air like a slap. Denise's hand paused momentarily as she processed the implication behind his words. Here was the assumption she'd been dreading, the automatic leap from her appearance to criminal activity that had plagued her throughout her life. But now she had tools to fight back that she'd never possessed before. "I work hard for what I have," she replied evenly, handing him her license. The document identified her as Denise R. Sterling, but Collins barely glanced at the name. He was too focused on confirming his preconceptions to notice the details that might have changed the entire trajectory of their encounter. Collins examined the license with theatrical scrutiny, holding it up to the light as if checking for forgeries. The address listed was in Buckhead, one of Atlanta's most affluent neighborhoods, which only reinforced his suspicions. In his narrow worldview, there were only a few ways someone who looked like Denise could afford to live in such an area, and none of them were legitimate. "This your car?" he asked, though the registration clearly showed her name as the owner. "Yes, it is," Denise replied, her patience beginning to thin. She glanced at her phone, noting that she was now running late for her lunch meeting. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. She was being delayed by the very type of police misconduct she'd been working to address in committee hearings. Collins walked around the Escalade, peering through the windows and running his hands along the exterior as if he might find contraband hidden in the paint job. His movements were slow and deliberate, designed to maximize the humiliation and inconvenience of the encounter. Other shoppers had begun to gather at a respectful distance, their phones recording the interaction from multiple angles. "This is a pretty expensive ride for someone just going grocery shopping," Collins said, returning to face Denise. "You sure you can afford the payments on this thing?" The question was loaded with assumptions and accusations that made Denise's blood boil, but she maintained her composure, knowing that any show of anger would only escalate the situation. "Officer, I've provided you with my license and registration. If there's no traffic violation or specific complaint, I'd like to continue with my day." Collins didn't like being rushed, especially not by someone he'd already decided was probably a criminal. The fact that she was articulate and well-dressed only made him more suspicious. In his experience, real criminals often went to great lengths to appear respectable. "I'm going to need you to step away from the vehicle," Collins said, his hand moving closer to his weapon. "I have reasonable suspicion to believe this car may be involved in illegal activity." Denise felt the familiar chill of escalation, the moment when a routine encounter transformed into something potentially dangerous. She could see the gathering crowd, could hear the whispered conversations of onlookers trying to understand what was happening. Most importantly, she could see the phones recording every word and gesture. "On what grounds?" she asked, her voice steady despite her rising anxiety. "I haven't committed any traffic violations. I'm not parked illegally. What reasonable suspicion do you have?" Collins's jaw tightened at her questions. Citizens weren't supposed to challenge his authority, weren't supposed to know their rights well enough to demand explanations. Her legal knowledge was another red flag in his mind, another sign that she was probably familiar with the criminal justice system for all the wrong reasons. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he said, his voice taking on a threatening edge. "Step away from the vehicle. Now." The parking lot had grown quieter, as if the very air was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Denise looked around at the faces of the onlookers, seeing a mixture of fear, anger, and anticipation. She knew that her next words and actions would determine not just the outcome of this encounter, but potentially the trajectory of Officer Collins' career. She had weapons in this fight that Collins couldn't see, tools that would soon reshape his understanding of power and consequence. But for now, she was just another black woman being harassed by a police officer who saw her expensive car as evidence of criminal activity rather than success. "Officer Collins," she said, reading his name tag with deliberate precision, "I want to be very clear about what's happening here. You've stopped me without cause, questioned my ability to afford my own vehicle, and are now ordering me to step away from my property without any legal justification. Collins felt a chill run down his spine as she spoke his name. There was something in her tone, a confidence that went beyond simple defiance. But his pride was now on the line, especially with the growing crowd of witnesses. He couldn't back down without losing face, couldn't admit that he'd made a mistake without acknowledging the assumptions that had led him to this moment. "Last warning," he said, his hand now resting on his weapon. "Step away from the vehicle or you'll be arrested for obstruction." Denise took a deep breath, knowing that the next few minutes would test everything she'd learned about power, justice, and the complex relationship between them. She had the tools to end this encounter immediately, to reveal her identity and watch Collins's entire demeanor change in an instant. But she also knew that doing so would rob her of the opportunity to experience firsthand what countless others endured without her advantages. "I'm stepping away," she said calmly, moving slowly away from her Escalade with her hands visible. "But I want you to know that I'm recording this encounter, and I'll be filing a complaint with your department about your conduct." Collins felt a surge of satisfaction as she complied with his orders. This was how it was supposed to work. He gave commands, citizens obeyed. The fact that she was recording didn't concern him. He'd faced complaints before, and nothing ever came of them. His department protected its officers, and his word would always carry more weight than hers. What Collins didn't know was that he wasn't just dealing with any citizen. The woman standing before him held more power than he could imagine, power that would soon reshape his entire understanding of consequences and accountability. But those revelations were still to come. For now he was simply a small-town cop, drunk on authority, about to learn a lesson about assumptions that would echo through the rest of his career. The afternoon sun continued to beat down on the parking lot, casting long shadows as the encounter moved into its next phase. Denise stood calmly beside her Escalade, her briefcase at her feet, while Collins prepared to escalate a situation that should never have begun. Around them, phones continued to record, capturing every moment of an interaction that would soon become a case study in the abuse of power and the unexpected ways justice could be served. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal not just the prejudices of one officer, but the complex dynamics of power, race, and authority in modern America. And at the center of it all stood Senator Denise Sterling, carrying secrets that would soon transform Officer Collins from predator to prey in ways he never could have imagined. Collins circled the Escalade like a predator sizing up its prey, his movements slow and deliberate as he peered through windows and examined every detail of the vehicle. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, forming a loose semicircle at a safe distance, their phones held high to capture every moment of the unfolding drama. The whispered conversations created a low buzz of tension that hung heavy in the humid Georgia air. Denise stood exactly where Collins had ordered her to, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, her posture straight and dignified despite the humiliating circumstances. Her briefcase sat at her feet, its burgundy leather surface reflecting the afternoon sun. Inside that case were documents that could reshape state policy, committee reports that bore her signature, and draft legislation that would soon be introduced on the Senate floor. But Collins saw none of that potential. All he saw was an expensive car and a woman he'd already judged guilty of something. "Nice rims," Collins said, crouching down to examine the Escalade's custom wheels. His tone carried a mocking edge that made several onlookers shift uncomfortably. "These probably cost more than most people make in a month. How exactly does someone like you afford upgrades like this?" The question hung in the air like a physical blow. Denise felt the familiar burn of discrimination, the automatic assumption that her success must be illegitimate because of the color of her skin. She'd faced these assumptions her entire life, from elementary school teachers who questioned her intelligence to law school professors who acted surprised by her academic achievements. Now, standing in a parking lot while a police officer implied she was a criminal, she felt the same rage she'd felt for decades. But Denise had learned to channel that rage into something more powerful than anger. Her voice remained steady as she replied, "I earned everything I have through hard work and dedication, Officer Collins, just like millions of other Americans who choose to invest in quality vehicles." Collins straightened up, irritated by her composure. In his experience, guilty people either became defensive and aggressive or nervous and apologetic. This woman's calm confidence felt like a personal insult, a challenge to his authority that needed to be addressed. He'd been hoping she would give him a reason to escalate the encounter, and her continued poise was denying him that satisfaction. "Hard work in what line of business?" he pressed, pulling out a small notebook and pen as if he were conducting an official investigation. "Because I've been patrolling this area for 8 years, and I know the difference between honest success and dirty money." A murmur rippled through the crowd of observers. Several people shook their heads in disgust, while others began speaking more loudly into their phones, describing the scene to friends and family members. One elderly white woman stepped closer, her voice carrying clearly across the parking lot. "This is disgraceful," she called out. "That officer should be ashamed of himself." Collins glanced toward the crowd, his jaw tightening with frustration. Witnesses were supposed to be on his side, supposed to trust that his badge and uniform represented justice and order. The fact that these people seemed to be sympathizing with his suspect made him even more determined to prove he was right about her. "Ma'am, I need you to step back," he called to the elderly woman. "This is official police business." But the woman didn't retreat. Instead, she pulled out her own phone and began recording. "I'm staying right here," she said firmly. "Somebody needs to witness what's happening." Denise watched the interaction with growing amazement. Throughout her political career, she'd advocated for police reform and accountability, but she'd never witnessed firsthand how ordinary citizens could stand up to abuse when they saw it happening. The solidarity of these strangers, most of whom didn't know her identity, was both heartening and heartbreaking. Collins turned his attention back to Denise, his frustration now clearly visible in the tight lines around his eyes. "I asked you a question about your line of work. Are you going to answer, or do I need to assume you have something to hide?" Denise considered her options carefully. She could end this encounter immediately by revealing her identity, by pulling out her Senate ID and watching Collins' entire demeanor change in an instant. But doing so would rob her of the authentic experience that so many of her constituents faced regularly. How could she truly advocate for police reform if she'd never experienced the full weight of police harassment herself? "I work in public service," she said simply, which was technically true even if it vastly understated her actual position. "I'm dedicated to making life better for the people of Georgia." Collins snorted derisively. "Public service doesn't pay enough for a car like this. Try again." The assumption behind his words was crystal clear. Someone who looked like Denise couldn't possibly earn enough through legitimate means to afford luxury. It was a prejudice so deeply ingrained that Collins didn't even seem aware of how transparently he was expressing it. "Officer Collins," Denise said, her voice taking on a sharper edge, "your assumptions about my ability to afford this vehicle are not only wrong, they're deeply offensive. You've provided no legitimate reason for this stop, and your questions are clearly based on racial profiling." The word profiling seemed to hit Collins like a physical blow. His face flushed red, and his hand moved instinctively toward his weapon. Being accused of racism was something he'd faced before, but he'd never learned to handle it gracefully. In his mind, his actions were always justified, always professional, regardless of the racial dynamics at play. "Don't you dare play the race card with me," he said, his voice rising to carry across the parking lot. "I treat everyone the same way. This has nothing to do with race and everything to do with suspicious behavior." "What suspicious behavior?" Denise asked calmly. "Sitting in my legally parked vehicle, stepping out to retrieve my briefcase, being well-dressed and successful. Collins felt trapped by her logic, frustrated by her ability to articulate the flaws in his reasoning. He'd expected this to be a simple encounter, a routine stop that would either result in an arrest or a quick release after he'd satisfied his curiosity. Instead, he found himself in a verbal chess match with an opponent who seemed to anticipate his every move. "The suspicious behavior," he said, fumbling for specific details, "is being in an expensive car in this area during business hours. Most people who shop here don't drive vehicles like this." "So you're saying I don't belong here because my car is too nice?" Denise asked, her tone remaining level despite the absurdity of his reasoning. "That's not suspicious behavior, Officer Collins. That's just shopping while successful." The crowd of onlookers had continued to grow, and several people began openly expressing their support for Denise. Comments like, "Leave her alone," and "This is ridiculous," could be heard clearly, creating an atmosphere of public disapproval that Collins had rarely experienced. Feeling cornered and humiliated, Collins made the decision to escalate. "I'm going to need to search your vehicle," he announced. "I have reasonable suspicion to believe it may contain contraband." "Based on what?" Denise asked immediately. "You've observed no criminal activity, detected no odors, and I've shown no signs of impairment. On what grounds do you claim reasonable suspicion?" Collins's face grew redder as he struggled to articulate a legal justification for his actions. The truth was that his suspicion was based entirely on racial stereotypes and class resentment, but he couldn't say that out loud. Instead, he fell back on the vague language that had served him in previous encounters. "You're being evasive and uncooperative," he said. "That gives me the right to investigate further." "I've answered every question you've asked," Denise replied calmly. "I've provided my license and registration. I've complied with every order you've given. How exactly have I been uncooperative?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, exposing the weakness of Collins' position. Around the parking lot, onlookers began calling out their own observations. "She's been nothing but polite," shouted one young man. "This is harassment, pure and simple," added a middle-aged woman. Collins felt the weight of public scrutiny pressing down on him like a physical force. He'd conducted dozens of similar stops throughout his career, but he'd never faced this level of organized opposition from witnesses. Usually, people minded their own business, trusting that police officers knew what they were doing. This crowd's vocal support for his suspect was unprecedented in his experience. "All of you need to step back and let me do my job," Collins shouted to the crowd, his composure finally beginning to crack. "This is official police business, and your interference is unacceptable." But the crowd didn't disperse. If anything, Collins's aggressive tone seemed to strengthen their resolve. More phones appeared, more people began voicing their disapproval, and the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Denise watched the scene unfold with a mixture of pride and concern. She was proud of these strangers who were willing to stand up against injustice, but she was also concerned about how far Collins might be willing to go to save face. She could see the desperation in his eyes, the realization that his assumptions had led him into a situation he couldn't easily escape. "Officer Collins," she said, her voice cutting through the noise of the crowd, "I think we both know this stop was inappropriate from the beginning. Why don't you return my license and registration and we can both move on with our day?" It was an offer of mercy, a chance for Collins to retreat gracefully without completely losing face. But pride and prejudice rarely make room for wisdom, and Collins was too invested in his narrative to accept the lifeline she was offering. "I'm calling for a tow truck," he announced, pulling out his radio. "This vehicle is going to be impounded pending investigation." The crowd erupted in outrage. Shouts of "This is crazy" and "Call his supervisor" filled the air as Collins spoke into his radio, requesting a tow truck for what he described as a suspicious vehicle investigation. Denise felt her patience finally beginning to fray. The encounter had moved beyond harassment into the realm of actual legal violation. Collins was now threatening to impound her vehicle without cause, to strand her in a parking lot because her success didn't match his preconceptions. Officer Collins, she said, her voice carrying a note of authority that made him pause mid-conversation with dispatch, I strongly advise you to reconsider this course of action. Impounding my vehicle without probable cause is a violation of my Fourth Amendment rights, and I can assure you that this encounter is being thoroughly documented. Collins lowered his radio, studying her face with new attention. There was something in her tone, a confidence that went beyond simple defiance. For the first time since the encounter began, he felt a flicker of uncertainty about his assumptions. "Are you threatening me?" he asked, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "I'm informing you," Denise replied calmly. "I'm informing you that your actions today will have consequences, and those consequences will extend far beyond this parking lot." Collins stared at her for a long moment, trying to read the expression on her face. There was no fear there, no anxiety about the power he held over her situation. Instead, he saw something that looked almost like pity, as if she felt sorry for the position he'd put himself in. The tow truck was already on its way, and Collins knew he couldn't cancel the request without looking foolish. He was committed to his course of action now, regardless of where it might lead. But as he looked at the crowd of witnesses, at the phones recording his every move, at the calm confidence of the woman he'd decided to target, he began to wonder if he'd made a terrible mistake. The afternoon sun was beginning to shift lower in the sky, casting longer shadows across the parking lot. What had started as a routine patrol had become a public spectacle, and Collins was starting to realize that he might not be the hero of this story. But it was too late to change course now. The wheels of his own making were already in motion, carrying him toward a reckoning he never could have imagined. Standing beside her impounded Escalade, Senator Denise Sterling waited patiently for the next act of a drama that would soon expose not just Collins' prejudices, but the complex web of power and accountability that governed their world. The tow truck was coming, but so were the consequences that would reshape everything Collins thought he knew about the balance of power in his small corner of Georgia. The tow truck arrived with a mechanical growl that seemed to punctuate the tension in the parking lot. Its driver, a burly white man named Eddie with oil-stained coveralls and 20 years of experience dealing with police impounds, climbed out of the cab and surveyed the scene with professional detachment. He'd seen hundreds of situations like this one, and they all followed the same basic script. Cop makes an arrest, car gets towed, everyone goes home. But as Eddie approached the Escalade and took in the crowd of agitated witnesses, he sensed this job might be different. The onlookers weren't dispersing as they usually did when the tow truck arrived. Instead, they seemed to be growing more organized, more vocal in their disapproval of what was happening. "You sure about this one, Randy?" Eddie asked Collins quietly, using the informal tone that came from years of working together on similar calls. "That's a pretty nice ride to be impounding without a clear violation." Collins bristled at the question, even from someone he considered an ally. He'd gone too far to back down now, had committed too much of his reputation to this course of action. Admitting doubt would be the same as admitting he'd been wrong from the beginning. "Just hook it up, Eddie," Collins said curtly. "I've got reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. The car gets impounded until we can conduct a thorough search." Eddie shrugged and began preparing his equipment, but his movements were slower than usual. Something about this situation felt off, and his instincts told him to proceed with caution. The woman who owned the Escalade stood watching him with an expression that was neither angry nor afraid, but rather patient, as if she were waiting for something specific to happen. Denise checked her phone and saw a series of increasingly urgent messages from her chief of staff. Her lunch meeting had already started without her, and her afternoon committee hearing was now in jeopardy. But more importantly, she could see that news of the incident was already beginning to spread on social media. Several of the onlookers had posted videos online, and the story was starting to gain traction with hashtags like "driving while successful" and "Atlanta PD." "Officer Collins," Denise said, her voice carrying clearly across the parking lot, Before you complete this impound, I think you should know that I've been in contact with my attorney. This encounter is being reviewed in real time by people who understand constitutional law. Collins felt another flutter of uncertainty, but his pride pushed it aside. Rich people always threatened to call their lawyers. It was a standard intimidation tactic that he'd learned to ignore. The fact that she had an attorney probably just confirmed his suspicions about her involvement in criminal activity. "Your lawyer can sort it out at the impound lot," Collins replied, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "If you're innocent, you'll get your car back." "Innocent of what?" Denise asked. "You still haven't articulated what crime you suspect me of committing. You've seen no contraband, observed no illegal activity, and documented no traffic violations. What exactly are you investigating?" The question cut to the heart of Collins's problem. He'd built his entire case on assumptions and stereotypes, but he'd never actually observed any criminal behavior. His reasonable suspicion existed only in his own prejudiced imagination, and Denise's calm questioning was forcing him to confront that uncomfortable truth. Eddie had finished preparing his equipment and was now attaching the Escalade to his tow truck. The mechanical sounds of chains and hydraulics seemed unnaturally loud in the tense atmosphere of the parking lot. Several onlookers had begun making phone calls, contacting local news stations and civil rights organizations to report what they were witnessing. As the Escalade was lifted onto the tow truck bed, Denise pulled out her phone and made a call that would change the entire dynamic of the encounter. The number she dialed connected her directly to the office of Atlanta's police chief, a man she'd worked with extensively on police reform initiatives. "Chief Morrison?" she said, her voice carrying easily across the parking lot. "This is Senator Sterling. I'm currently being harassed by one of your officers in the Kroger parking lot on Peachtree." "Yes, that's right. Senator Sterling." Collins felt the blood drain from his face as the words registered. Senator. The woman he'd been tormenting for the past hour, the person he'd assumed was a criminal based on nothing more than racist stereotypes, was a Georgia state senator. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and he stumbled slightly as the full magnitude of his mistake became clear. The crowd of onlookers who had only heard Denise's side of the phone conversation began piecing together what was happening. Murmurs of, "Did she say senator?" and "Oh my God, he's in trouble now," rippled through the gathered witnesses. Phones that had already been recording turned toward Collins, capturing his expression as understanding dawned. "Chief Morrison is on his way," Denise announced, ending her call and returning her phone to her purse. "He's very interested in discussing Officer Collins's interpretation of reasonable suspicion and proper police procedure." Collins stood frozen, his mind racing through the implications of what he'd just learned. He'd stopped, harassed, and ordered the impound of a state senator's vehicle based on nothing more than racial profiling. Every assumption he'd made, every justification he'd offered, was now revealed as the prejudiced nonsense it had always been. Eddie, who had been preparing to drive away with the Escalade, stopped his truck and climbed out of the cab. "Randy," he said quietly, "maybe we should unhook this one and let everybody go home." But Collins was trapped by his own actions. The impound order had already been processed, the paperwork had already been started, and dozens of witnesses had recorded every moment of the encounter. He couldn't simply pretend it hadn't happened, couldn't make it all go away by acknowledging his mistake. "The impound stands," Collins said weakly, though his voice cracked as he spoke. "I was following proper procedure based on the information I had at the time." Denise smiled for the first time since the encounter began, but it wasn't an expression of joy. It was the cold smile of someone who had just watched an opponent fall into a trap of their own making. "Officer Collins," she said, her voice now carrying the full authority of her position, "let me help you understand the information you should have had. I am Senator Denise Sterling, chair of the Senate Committee on Criminal Justice Reform. For the past 3 years, I've been working on legislation to address exactly the kind of racial profiling and police misconduct you've demonstrated here today." The parking lot fell silent except for the distant hum of traffic and the mechanical sounds of Eddie's tow truck. Collins felt as if the ground was shifting beneath his feet. Every word out of his mouth, every assumption he'd made, every justification he'd offered was now being viewed through a completely different lens. Furthermore, Denise continued, her voice steady and measured, this entire encounter has been recorded by multiple witnesses and will be part of a comprehensive review of police practices in this district. Your conduct today will serve as a case study in exactly the kind of behavior our reform legislation is designed to address. Collins opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could he possibly say that would make this situation better? How could he explain that his reasonable suspicion had been based on nothing more than seeing a successful black woman in an expensive car? The sound of approaching sirens broke through his paralysis. Multiple police vehicles were converging on the parking lot, led by a black SUV that Collins recognized as belonging to Chief Morrison. The cavalry was coming, but not for him. They were coming to clean up his mess and assess the damage he'd done to the department's reputation. Chief Morrison arrived first, stepping out of his vehicle with the controlled urgency of a man who knew he was walking into a public relations nightmare. He was a tall, distinguished black man in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of presence that commanded immediate respect. His uniform was immaculate, his bearing professional, and his expression carefully neutral as he surveyed the scene. "Senator Sterling," he said, approaching with his hand extended. "I apologize for this situation. We'll get it sorted out immediately." Denise shook his hand, but didn't smile. "Chief Morrison, I appreciate your prompt response. Officer Collins has spent the last hour demonstrating exactly why our police reform legislation is necessary." Chief Morrison's jaw tightened as he looked at Collins, who stood frozen beside the tow truck like a deer caught in headlights. The chief had worked hard to build bridges with the community, to reform the department's image and practices. One officer's prejudice could undo years of progress. "Officer Collins," Chief Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of command, "I need you to explain your justification for this stop and impound." Collins felt every eye in the parking lot focused on him as he struggled to find words that would make his actions seem reasonable. The crowd of witnesses had grown even larger, and he could see news vans beginning to arrive in the distance. His career was unraveling in real time, broadcast live on social media for the world to see. "Chief," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I observed suspicious behavior and followed department protocol for investigating potential criminal activity." "What suspicious behavior?" Chief Morrison asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer would be inadequate. Collins looked around desperately, as if the parking lot itself might provide him with a reasonable explanation. But there was nothing there except his own prejudice and the expensive car that had triggered his assumptions. The vehicle was expensive, Collins said weakly. Unusually expensive for someone shopping in this area during business hours. Chief Morrison closed his eyes briefly, as if absorbing the full impact of what Collins had just admitted. When he opened them again, his expression was one of barely controlled anger. "Officer Collins," he said, his voice carrying across the parking lot for all to hear, "you just admitted to stopping a citizen because her car was too nice. You've essentially confessed to profiling based on economic status and, given the demographic assumptions underlying your reasoning, racial bias." Collins wanted to protest, wanted to explain that it wasn't about race, but the words died in his throat. How could he explain that his suspicions were based on legitimate law enforcement instincts when those instincts had led him to harass a state senator? How could he claim his actions weren't racially motivated when he'd automatically assumed a successful black woman must be a criminal? Eddie, who had been watching the exchange with growing discomfort, finally spoke up. "Chief, should I unhook the vehicle? This whole thing seems like it might be a mistake." Chief Morrison nodded curtly. "Yes, release the vehicle immediately. And Eddie, there won't be any charges for the towing service. The department will cover the cost of your time." As Eddie began the process of releasing the Escalade from his tow truck, Denise stepped forward to address the crowd of witnesses who had supported her throughout the ordeal. "I want to thank everyone who stayed to witness this encounter," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the parking lot. "Your presence here today, your willingness to record what was happening and speak out against injustice, demonstrates the power of community accountability." The crowd responded with applause and expressions of support. Several people approached to shake her hand or take photos, turning what had been a humiliating encounter into something resembling a campaign event. Collins watched the scene with growing despair. Not only had he harassed a state senator, but he'd done it in front of dozens of witnesses who were now celebrating her vindication. Every phone in the crowd had recorded his mistakes, and those videos were already spreading across social media platforms. Chief Morrison approached Collins with the weary expression of a leader who'd seen too many of these incidents. "Officer Collins, you're suspended pending a full investigation. I need your badge and weapon." The words hit Collins like physical blows. He'd been a police officer for 8 years, had built his identity around the authority that came with the badge and gun. Now both were being taken away because of his assumptions about a woman who had turned out to be more powerful than he could have imagined. "Chief," Collins pleaded, "this was just a misunderstanding. I was doing my job based on the training I received." Chief Morrison's expression hardened. "If this is what your training taught you, then we need better training. And if this is how you interpret that training, then maybe police work isn't the right career for you." As Collins fumbled with his badge and weapon, handing them over with shaking hands, Denise approached Chief Morrison with a proposal that would transform this incident from a personal embarrassment into a catalyst for systemic change. "Chief Morrison," she said, "I'd like to propose that Officer Collins become part of our police reform initiative, not as punishment, but as education. This encounter has shown us exactly what's wrong with current training and attitudes. Officer Collins could help us develop better protocols by serving as an example of what not to do." Collins looked up hopefully, seeing a possible lifeline in her offer. Maybe this didn't have to be the end of his career. Maybe he could learn from his mistakes and become part of the solution. But Chief Morrison shook his head firmly. "Senator Sterling, I appreciate your willingness to turn this into a learning opportunity. But Officer Collins's actions today were so far outside acceptable parameters that I can't in good conscience keep him on the force. The investigation will determine whether criminal charges are appropriate, but his law enforcement career ends today." The finality of those words settled over Collins like a shroud. 8 years of his life, his entire professional identity, were gone because he'd made assumptions about a woman based on the color of her skin and the car she drove. The irony wasn't lost on him. In trying to prove his worth as a police officer, he'd demonstrated exactly why police reform was necessary. As the crowd began to disperse and the news crews set up their equipment, Denise retrieved her briefcase from beside her now-released Escalade. Inside were the documents she'd been working on when this encounter began, including draft legislation that would make incidents like this one grounds for immediate termination and criminal prosecution. "Officer Collins," she said, approaching him one final time, "I hope you understand that this isn't personal. This is about accountability, about ensuring that people in positions of power use that power responsibly." Collins nodded numbly, unable to meet her eyes. He understood now that he'd never really had power at all. He'd had authority, a badge and a gun, and the presumption of legitimacy that came with them. But real power, the kind Denise wielded, came from knowledge, from connections, from the ability to change systems rather than simply enforce them. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, the words barely audible above the bustle of the parking lot. "I was wrong about you. I was wrong about everything." Denise studied his face for a moment, seeing genuine remorse mixed with the shock of his downfall. "Officer Collins," she said finally, "maybe this experience will help you understand what it feels like to be judged by your appearance rather than your character. Maybe it will make you a better person, even if it's made you an ex-police officer." As Denise drove away in her Escalade, heading to salvage what remained of her scheduled meetings, Collins stood alone in the parking lot where his career had ended. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the asphalt. and he realized that his life was about to become very different. He'd started the day as Officer Randy Collins, a man with authority and presumed respect. He was ending it as simply Randy Collins, unemployed and facing possible criminal charges, his assumptions and prejudices exposed for the world to see. The parking lot was nearly empty now, just Collins and the lingering smell of exhaust from the departed news vans. In the distance, he could see the lights of the grocery store where normal people were conducting normal business, unaware that a career had just ended and a lesson in power had just been taught. Tomorrow, the videos of this encounter would be played on news stations across Georgia. The story would become a case study in police academies and civil rights organizations. Officer Collins' moment of prejudice would live forever on the internet, a permanent reminder of what happened when assumptions met reality. But tonight he was just a man standing in a parking lot, finally beginning to understand the difference between authority and power, between enforcement and justice, between the badge he'd worn and the woman who just taught him the most expensive lesson of his life. The Atlanta Police Department headquarters buzzed with unusual tension as news of the parking lot incident spread through the building like wildfire. Officers clustered around computer screens, watching cell phone videos of their colleagues' spectacular downfall, their expressions ranging from shock to embarrassment to carefully concealed satisfaction. The break room conversations were hushed but heated, with veterans defending Collins while younger officers shook their heads in disgust. Chief Morrison sat in his office, surrounded by the documentation of what was quickly becoming the department's most high-profile misconduct case in years. The preliminary investigation report lay open on his desk, its findings as damning as they were predictable. Collins had violated virtually every protocol for citizen interactions, had demonstrated clear racial bias, and had done it all in front of cameras that captured every damaging moment. His phone had been ringing constantly since the incident, with calls from the mayor's office, civil rights organizations, and news outlets all demanding statements and explanations. The department's public relations team was working overtime to craft responses that acknowledged the seriousness of Collins' actions without admitting broader systemic failures. Meanwhile, Collins himself sat in a sterile interview room 2 floors below, officially suspended and facing an internal affairs investigation that would determine whether criminal charges were warranted. His union representative, a graying veteran named Tom Bradley, sat beside him reviewing the evidence that had been compiled in record time. "Randy," Bradley said quietly, "I've been doing this for 20 years and I've never seen a case this clear-cut. The videos are devastating. Your own statements to the chief are essentially confessions of racial profiling. There's no defense strategy that can overcome what happened in that parking lot." Collins stared at the table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. The reality of his situation was finally sinking in. Not only was his career over, but he was facing potential criminal charges for civil rights violations. The federal authorities were already making inquiries, drawn by the high-profile nature of the victim and the clear evidence of constitutional violations. "What about my pension?" Collins asked weakly. "I've got 8 years on the force. My family depends on that income." Bradley's expression was sympathetic but realistic. "Randy, you're looking at termination for cause. That means no pension, no benefits, no recommendation letters. The department is going to distance itself from you as quickly and completely as possible." The words hit Collins like physical blows. He'd built his entire adult life around his identity as a police officer, and now that identity was being stripped away along with his financial security. His wife would have to find work. His children would grow up with the stigma of having a father who'd been fired for racism, and he'd have to rebuild his life from scratch at 35 years old. 3 miles away, in the elegant offices of Sterling and Associates, Senator Denise Sterling was conducting damage control of her own. Her chief of staff, Vanessa Thompson, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with an encyclopedic knowledge of political strategy, was coordinating responses to the media frenzy that had erupted around the incident. "The story's gone national," Vanessa reported, scrolling through her tablet as she spoke. CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. They're all running the video. The hashtag driving while successful is trending on Twitter, and you're being praised as a hero for handling the situation with such dignity. Denise sat behind her mahogany desk, still wearing the same navy blazer from the morning's encounter, though she'd finally had time to properly process what had happened. The incident had been personally humiliating, but it had also provided her with something invaluable, a first-hand experience of police harassment that would lend authenticity to her reform efforts. "How's the committee responding?" Denise asked, referring to the Criminal Justice Reform Committee she chaired. "They're fast-tracking your police accountability bill," Vanessa replied. "The incident has given your legislation the kind of real-world relevance that lawmakers can't ignore. Senator Davidson called it a perfect case study in why reform is necessary." Denise nodded, though she took no satisfaction in the political opportunity that Collins's misconduct had created. She would have preferred to achieve police reform without having to endure racial profiling herself, but if her experience could prevent others from facing similar harassment, then perhaps some good could come from Collins' prejudice. Her phone buzzed with a call from the governor's office. Governor Patricia Hayes, a moderate Democrat who had been supportive but cautious about police reform, was now fully on board with Denise's initiatives. "Denise," the governor said without preamble, "I've seen the videos. I'm appalled by Officer Collins' conduct, and I want you to know that you have my complete support for whatever legislative response you think is appropriate." "Thank you, Governor," Denise replied. "I think this incident demonstrates exactly why we need mandatory bias training, citizen oversight boards, and clear consequences for officers who abuse their authority." "Draft whatever you need," Governor Hayes said. "After today, you'll have bipartisan support for police reform. Even the Republicans can't defend what Collins did." As word of the incident continued to spread, Collins found himself the subject of intense scrutiny from investigators, journalists, and social media users who had turned him into a symbol of everything wrong with American policing. His personal information had been leaked online, his home address published on social media, and his family was receiving threats from angry strangers who'd seen the videos. His wife Karen, a kindergarten teacher who had always been proud of her husband's service, now found herself defending their family against accusations of racism and demands that she leave her husband. The school district was under pressure to investigate whether her employment should be affected by her association with Collins' actions. "Randy," she said during a tense conversation at their kitchen table, "I don't understand how this happened. You've never talked like that at home. You've never expressed those kinds of views about black people." Collins struggled to explain something he didn't fully understand himself. "Karen, it wasn't about her being black. It was about the car, the situation, the way she acted like she was better than me." But even as he spoke the words, Collins knew they weren't true. The encounter had been about race from the moment he'd first seen Denise in the parking lot. His assumptions, his suspicions, his decision to escalate the situation had all been rooted in racial stereotypes he'd absorbed over years of policing in a department that had never adequately addressed its own biases. Karen stared at her husband with growing horror. "Randy, do you hear yourself? You're saying you harassed a woman because she acted like she was better than you? She is better than you. She's a state senator. She's accomplished and successful and educated. Maybe she acted confident because she had every right to be confident." The conversation continued late into the night, with Karen forcing Collins to confront uncomfortable truths about his motivations and assumptions. It was a reckoning that was long overdue, but it came at the cost of his career, his reputation, and potentially his marriage. Meanwhile, the broader implications of the incident were beginning to ripple through Georgia's political and law enforcement communities. Police chiefs across the state were reviewing their training programs and use of force policies, knowing that they couldn't afford to have their own officers become the next viral symbol of police misconduct. Civil rights organizations were using the incident as a rallying point for broader reform efforts. The NAACP, the ACLU, and dozens of local advocacy groups were coordinating their responses, demanding not just accountability for Collins, but systemic changes that would prevent similar incidents from occurring. At Atlanta Police Headquarters, Chief Morrison was conducting a comprehensive review of the department's practices and training protocols. The Collins incident had exposed weaknesses in the system that he could no longer ignore, and he was determined to implement changes that would restore public trust in his officers. "We're going to use this as a learning opportunity," he announced during a department-wide meeting. "Every officer is going to receive additional training in cultural sensitivity, constitutional rights, and proper procedures for citizen interactions. What Officer Collins did was unacceptable, and we're going to make sure it never happens again." But for some officers in the department, Morrison's response felt like a betrayal of their colleague. They saw Collins as a scapegoat, a good officer who had made a mistake and was being crucified for it because the victim happened to be politically connected. Sergeant Mike Torres, a 15-year veteran who had worked with Collins on several cases, was among those who felt the department was throwing Collins under the bus to appease political pressure. "Randy's not a racist," Torres told his partner during their patrol shift. "He's just old school. He believes in proactive policing, in questioning suspicious behavior. If he'd stopped a white guy in an expensive car, nobody would have cared." But Torres's partner, Officer Jasmine Washington, a young black woman who had joined the force 2 years earlier, saw the situation differently. "Mike," she said carefully, "did you watch the videos? Really watch them? Because what I saw was a white officer assuming a black woman was a criminal based on nothing but her car and her race. That's not proactive policing. That's racial profiling." The conversation reflected broader tensions within the department about race, policing practices, and the appropriate response to Collins' actions. Some officers saw him as a victim of political correctness, while others recognized his conduct as emblematic of problems they'd witnessed throughout their careers. As the investigation into Collins's conduct continued, federal authorities began their own review of the incident. The FBI's Civil Rights Division was considering whether to file federal charges against Collins for violating Denise's constitutional rights under color of law. Special Agent Maria Rodriguez, who specialized in police misconduct cases, reviewed the evidence with the clinical detachment of someone who had seen dozens of similar incidents. The video evidence was clear, Collins's statements were incriminating, and the victim's high profile ensured that the case would receive maximum attention from federal prosecutors. "This is as clear-cut as they get," Rodriguez told her supervisor during their case review meeting. Officer Collins stopped the senator based on racial stereotypes, escalated the encounter without justification, and ordered an unlawful impound of her vehicle. "We've got multiple constitutional violations captured on video." The federal investigation added another layer of pressure to Collins's situation. State criminal charges were possible, but federal civil rights violations carried much stiffer penalties and would mark him as someone who had violated the most fundamental principles of American justice. As the days passed, the incident continued to generate national attention and spark conversations about race, policing, and accountability. Denise found herself at the center of a media storm, giving interviews and making speeches about the need for police reform while trying to maintain her regular legislative duties. During one particularly powerful interview on a national news program, she articulated the broader significance of what had happened in that parking lot. "This incident wasn't just about one officer's prejudice," she said, looking directly into the camera. "It was about a system that allows officers to act on racial assumptions without consequences. It was about the presumption that successful black people must be criminals, that expensive cars in our hands must be ill-gotten gains." The interviewer pressed her about whether she believed Collins was consciously racist or simply acting on unconscious bias. "I don't know what was in Officer Collins' heart," Denise replied. "But I know what was in his actions, and those actions were rooted in the same racial stereotypes that have plagued our country for generations. Whether conscious or unconscious, bias in policing has the same harmful effects on the communities officers are supposed to serve. Her words resonated with viewers across the country, particularly in Black communities where similar encounters were all too common. The difference was that most victims didn't have Denise's political power or media platform to fight back effectively. As the investigation moved toward its conclusion, Collins faced the reality that his life was permanently changed. The man who had started that morning as a confident police officer with 8 years of experience was now an unemployed symbol of police misconduct, facing potential criminal charges and a future filled with uncertainty. His fall from authority to disgrace had been swift and complete, a reminder that in the age of cell phone cameras and social media, a single moment of poor judgment could destroy a career and reshape a life forever. 6 months after the parking lot encounter that ended Randy Collins' law enforcement career, the ripple effects of that humid Georgia afternoon continued to reshape lives and institutions across the state. The incident had become more than just a case study in police misconduct. It had evolved into a catalyst for fundamental changes in how law enforcement approached community relations and accountability. The courtroom in downtown Atlanta was packed as Collins faced the consequences of his actions in both criminal and civil proceedings. The criminal charges filed by the Fulton County District Attorney's Office included official oppression, false imprisonment, and civil rights violations under state law. Additionally, federal prosecutors had filed charges under Section 1983 of the Civil Rights Act, alleging that Collins had violated Senator Sterling's constitutional rights under color of law. Collins sat at the defendant's table wearing an ill-fitting gray suit. His appearance dramatically changed from the confident officer who had approached Denise's Escalade months earlier. He had lost weight, his face was drawn with stress, and his eyes carried the haunted look of a man who had watched his entire world collapse. Beside him sat his court-appointed attorney, David Kim, a dedicated public defender who was fighting an uphill battle against overwhelming evidence. The prosecution's case was devastating in its simplicity. Video evidence from multiple angles showed Collins' approach, his baseless questioning, and his decision to impound Denise's vehicle without cause. His own recorded statements provided clear evidence of racial profiling, and expert witnesses had testified about the constitutional violations inherent in his actions. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Assistant District Attorney Michelle Barnes said during her closing argument, "this case is about the abuse of power and the violation of constitutional rights. Officer Collins saw a successful Black woman in an expensive car and immediately assumed criminal activity. He then used the authority granted to him by his badge to harass, humiliate, and ultimately arrest someone whose only crime was driving while Black and successful." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Collins was sentenced to 18 months in prison, a punishment that reflected both the seriousness of his crimes and the court's determination to send a message about police accountability. As Collins was led away in handcuffs, his wife Karen sat in the gallery weeping silently. Their marriage had not survived the scandal, and she had filed for divorce 2 months earlier. The children were living with her parents while she tried to rebuild her life and career, both of which had been damaged by association with her ex-husband's actions. The civil lawsuit filed by Senator Sterling was settled out of court for an undisclosed sum, but sources close to the case suggested the amount was substantial enough to send a message to police departments across Georgia about the cost of allowing officers to act on racial bias. Meanwhile, the legislative response to the incident had been swift and comprehensive. Senator Sterling's police reform bill, now known as the Parking Lot Accountability Act, had passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. The legislation mandated bias training for all law enforcement officers, established citizen oversight boards in every major jurisdiction, and created a statewide database of police misconduct that would prevent problem officers from simply moving to different departments. Governor Hayes had signed the bill in a ceremony attended by civil rights leaders, police reform advocates, and law enforcement officials who supported the changes. Standing beside Denise at the signing, the governor spoke about the incident's transformative impact on state policy. What happened to Senator Sterling in that parking lot was wrong, but her response to that injustice has made our state better, Governor Hayes said. This legislation ensures that no citizen will face the kind of harassment Senator Sterling endured without consequences for the officers involved. The Atlanta Police Department had undergone its own transformation in the wake of the incident. Chief Morrison had implemented comprehensive reforms that went far beyond what was required by the new state legislation. Every officer was required to complete 40 hours of additional training focused on implicit bias, constitutional rights, and proper procedures for citizen interactions. The department had also established a new internal affairs protocol that fast-tracked investigations of racial profiling complaints and mandated automatic review of any stop involving a citizen with no prior criminal history. Body cameras, which had been optional equipment, became mandatory for all patrol officers, and the footage was automatically uploaded to a secure server that prevented tampering or selective editing. Officer Jasmine Washington, who had witnessed the aftermath of Collins' downfall, was selected to help develop the new training programs. Her perspective as a young black officer provided valuable insights into the challenges of policing diverse communities while maintaining constitutional standards. The Collins incident forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about policing, Washington said during a training session with new recruits. We had to acknowledge that good intentions aren't enough if our actions are guided by unconscious bias. Every interaction we have with citizens is an opportunity to either build trust or destroy it. The training programs included scenario-based exercises that required officers to examine their assumptions and decision-making processes. Officers were confronted with situations similar to the Collins-Sterling encounter and forced to articulate their reasoning for stops, searches, and arrests. One particularly powerful exercise involved officers reviewing video of the original incident without knowing the identities of those involved. Recruits were asked to evaluate Collins's actions and justify his decisions. The exercise consistently revealed how difficult it was to find legitimate law enforcement reasons for the stop once racial assumptions were removed from the equation. The federal investigation into the Atlanta Police Department's broader practices had revealed patterns of misconduct that extended beyond Collins's individual actions. The Department of Justice had entered into a consent decree with the city, requiring ongoing federal oversight of police practices and regular reporting on progress toward reform goals. Special Agent Rodriguez, who had investigated Collins's civil rights violations, was assigned to monitor the department's compliance with the consent decree. Her report showed steady progress in reducing complaints of racial profiling and excessive force, though she acknowledged that cultural change in law enforcement was a long-term process. The Collins case was a wake-up call for a lot of officers, Rodriguez explained during a community meeting about police reform. It showed them that actions have consequences, that body cameras and social media mean their conduct will be scrutinized, and that victims of misconduct might have more power than they assumed. Collins himself had become an unwitting symbol of the need for police reform, his name attached to training materials and case studies used in law enforcement academies across the country. The irony was not lost on him as he served his sentence in a minimum security prison, reading news articles about reforms inspired by his misconduct. He had been approached by several documentary filmmakers and authors interested in telling his story, but Collins had declined all interviews. His lawyer advised him that speaking publicly about the incident could complicate any future appeals or parole applications. In his cell at night, Collins often reflected on the moment when his assumptions about Denise Sterling had been shattered. He had built his entire worldview around stereotypes and prejudices that seemed reasonable until they were tested against reality. The woman he had assumed was a criminal had turned out to be more powerful and accomplished than he could have imagined. The encounter had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his own motivations and biases. He had told himself that his actions were based on legitimate law enforcement concerns, but the evidence had made it clear that racial stereotypes had guided his decision-making from the beginning. Collins had enrolled in educational programs available to prisoners, including courses on African American history and constitutional law. It was a small step toward understanding the broader context of his actions, though he knew it could never undo the harm he had caused or restore the career he had destroyed. Senator Sterling had used the incident as a platform to advocate for comprehensive criminal justice reform at the national level. She had testified before Congress about the need for federal standards on police accountability and had become a sought-after speaker at conferences on racial justice and police reform. During one particularly moving speech at the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People's annual convention, she spoke about the broader significance of her parking lot encounter. "What happened to me wasn't unique," she told the audience. "The only thing that made my experience different was that I had the power to fight back, to demand accountability, to turn harassment into a catalyst for change." But for every Senator Sterling who can hold a press conference, there are thousands of citizens who face similar treatment without recourse. Her words resonated with audience members who had faced their own encounters with biased policing. The difference between Denise's experience and theirs wasn't the nature of the harassment, but the resources and platforms she possessed to respond effectively. The incident had also sparked conversations within Black communities about the complex relationship between success and safety. Even achieving the highest levels of professional and political success didn't provide immunity from racial profiling, a reality that was both sobering and motivating for young people who looked up to Denise as a role model. At historically Black colleges and universities across Georgia, student organizations invited Denise to speak about her experience and the importance of civic engagement in fighting injustice. Her message was consistent. Individual success was meaningless without collective progress, and those with privilege had an obligation to use it on behalf of those without. "I didn't choose to become a symbol," she told students at Morehouse College during one such visit. "But when life puts you in that position, you have a responsibility to make your experience meaningful." Officer Collins tried to diminish me by treating me like a criminal. Instead, he gave me a powerful tool to fight for justice. The students responded with enthusiasm, seeing in Denise's story both the persistence of racial bias and the possibility of overcoming it through preparation, persistence, and political power. As the first anniversary of the parking lot incident approached, Atlanta prepared to mark the date with a series of events focused on police accountability and racial justice. The Kroger parking lot where Collins had harassed Denise was designated as a historical site, with a small plaque commemorating the encounter and its aftermath. The plaque's inscription was simple but powerful. On this site, Senator Denise Sterling was subjected to racial profiling by Officer Randy Collins. Her dignified response to injustice sparked reforms that made our community stronger and more just. Local civil rights organizations planned a series of workshops and community forums to discuss ongoing challenges in police-community relations. The events would bring together law enforcement officials, community leaders, and citizens to continue the conversations that Collins's misconduct had started. Chief Morrison, who had survived the scandal and implemented successful reforms, reflected on the year since the incident during an interview with a local news station. "The Collins incident was a crisis for our department," he acknowledged, "but it was also an opportunity. It forced us to examine our practices, confront our biases, and implement changes that have made us better officers and better servants of our community." The statistics supported his claims. Complaints of racial profiling had decreased by 60% since the incident, use of force incidents were down 40%, and community satisfaction with police services had improved significantly according to independent surveys. But Morrison was careful not to declare victory prematurely. Reform is an ongoing process, he emphasized. We can't let the improvements we've made make us complacent. Every day, every interaction, every decision is an opportunity to either build trust or destroy it. As the anniversary approached, Denise Sterling continued her work in the state Senate, using her enhanced profile to advance legislation on education, healthcare, and economic development. The parking lot incident had given her a national platform, but she was determined not to let it define her entire career. "I'm proud of the reforms we achieved after that encounter with Officer Collins," she said during a recent interview. "But I don't want to be known only as the senator who was profiled. I want to be remembered for all the work I've done to make life better for the people of Georgia." The transformation of Randy Collins from confident police officer to convicted criminal served as a stark reminder of how quickly assumptions and prejudices could destroy a career and a life. His fall from authority to imprisonment illustrated the new reality for law enforcement officers who acted on racial bias rather than legitimate police concerns. The parking lot in Atlanta where it all began looked much the same as it had that humid afternoon months earlier. Shoppers still navigated between rows of cars, still conducted their business under the watchful oak tree that had provided shade during Collins' downfall. But the dynamics of power and accountability in that space had been fundamentally altered. What had started as a routine patrol had become a watershed moment in the fight for police accountability and racial justice. One officer's prejudice had sparked reforms that would protect countless citizens from similar harassment, while one woman's courage had transformed a moment of humiliation into a catalyst for lasting change. The story of Senator Denise Sterling and Officer Randy Collins had become more than just a case study in police misconduct. It had become a parable about power and prejudice, assumptions and consequences, the cost of bias and the price of justice. And in parking lots across America, similar encounters continued to play out. But now with the knowledge that body cameras were recording, that witnesses were watching, and that victims might possess more power than their harassers could ever imagine. The fight for justice was far from over, but thanks to one woman's refusal to be diminished and one officer's spectacular downfall, the balance of power had shifted in ways that would protect future generations from the assumptions and prejudices that had once gone unchallenged. In the end, Officer Collins had been right about one thing: the truth always finds a way. He just hadn't expected it to find its way to his own destruction and her ultimate vindication. And just like that, assumptions met reality in the most spectacular way possible. A routine day turned into a career-ending nightmare for one officer, while a shopping trip became a powerful moment of justice for a woman who refused to be silenced. This story isn't just about one encounter in a parking lot. It's about the power of standing up to injustice, the importance of accountability, and the reminder that in our interconnected world, actions have consequences that extend far beyond what we might imagine. Officer Collins learned the hard way that badges and uniforms don't grant immunity from accountability. His assumptions about success and race led him down a path that destroyed his career and landed him in prison. But his downfall became the catalyst for reforms that would protect countless others from similar harassment. Senator Sterling showed us what dignity looks like in the face of discrimination. Her calm response to harassment, her strategic use of power, and her commitment to turning personal injustice into systemic change demonstrate the kind of leadership our communities need. The parking lot where it all happened looks the same today, but the world around it has changed. Police departments across Georgia have implemented new training programs, oversight mechanisms have been strengthened, and officers know that their actions are being watched and will be judged. The lesson here isn't just about police reform or racial justice, though those are crucial elements of the story. It's about the danger of assumptions, the power of preparation, and the reality that in the age of cell phone cameras and social media, truth has a way of surfacing that previous generations never experienced. Every day, in parking lots and street corners across America, similar encounters play out between law enforcement and citizens. The difference now is that officers know they're being watched, victims know they have recourse, and communities understand that they have the power to demand better. Randy Collins thought he was dealing with just another suspicious person in an expensive car. Instead, he encountered someone who had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation, someone with the knowledge, resources, and platform to fight back effectively. Senator Sterling could have ended the encounter immediately by revealing her identity. Instead, she chose to experience the full weight of police harassment, to understand firsthand what so many of her constituents faced regularly. That choice gave her the authenticity and moral authority to lead meaningful reform efforts. The reforms that followed the incident weren't just policy changes. They were cultural shifts that acknowledged the reality of racial bias in law enforcement and created mechanisms to address it. Training programs now force officers to confront their assumptions, oversight boards provide accountability, and body cameras ensure that encounters are documented. But perhaps the most important change was in the balance of power itself. Citizens now know that they have tools to fight back against harassment, that their voices can be heard, and that justice is possible even when it seems like the system is stacked against them. The story of what happened in that Atlanta parking lot has become a teaching tool used in police academies, law schools, and civil rights organizations across the country. It's a reminder that individual actions can have far-reaching consequences, and that standing up for what's right sometimes requires courage we didn't know we possessed. Collins's fall from authority to disgrace was swift and complete, but it wasn't without purpose. His misconduct became the foundation for reforms that will protect future generations from similar harassment. His prejudice became a catalyst for progress that might not have been possible without such a clear and documented example of what was wrong with the system. Today, new police recruits learn about the Collins case as part of their training on constitutional rights and proper procedures. They watch the videos, study the testimony, and discuss the legal and ethical failures that led to his downfall. The message is clear. Assumptions based on race or class will not be tolerated, and officers who act on such bias will face serious consequences. The intersection of race, class, and power that played out in that parking lot continues to resonate in communities across America. The encounter between a white officer and a black senator revealed tensions and assumptions that exist throughout our society, but it also demonstrated the possibility of change when people are willing to fight for it. Senator Sterling's briefcase, which had sat unnoticed during her harassment, contained legislation that would reshape criminal justice policy across Georgia. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who understood the full story. While Collins was profiling her as a potential criminal, she was literally carrying the tools to reform the system he represented. The transformation of public discourse around police accountability can be traced directly to moments like the one captured in that parking lot. When citizens see clear evidence of misconduct, when they witness the abuse of power firsthand, they become more willing to support reforms that might have seemed unnecessary or excessive before. The story also highlights the importance of preparation and knowledge in confronting injustice. Senator Sterling's calm demeanor and strategic response weren't just personality traits. They were the result of years of experience in politics, law, and public service. She knew her rights, understood the system, and had the resources to fight back effectively. But the broader lesson is that everyone can prepare for encounters with law enforcement by understanding their constitutional rights, documenting interactions when possible, and knowing how to file complaints and seek accountability when those rights are violated. The parking lot incident became a symbol of both the persistence of racial bias and the possibility of overcoming it through courage, preparation, and strategic action. It showed that even in the face of systematic inequality, individuals can make a difference when they refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. As we reflect on this story, we're reminded that progress rarely happens accidentally. It requires people like Senator Sterling who are willing to turn personal humiliation into public action, communities that support accountability over loyalty to authority, and institutions that are willing to change when confronted with evidence of their failures. The encounter that began with Collins's assumptions about a successful black woman in an expensive car ended with his imprisonment and her vindication. It's a powerful reminder that in a just society, truth and accountability must ultimately prevail over prejudice and abuse of power. Officer Collins started that day as a man with authority, convinced of his right to judge others based on their appearance and his assumptions. He ended it as an ex-officer facing criminal charges, his career destroyed by the very prejudices he thought justified his actions. Senator Sterling started that day as a public servant running errands between meetings. She ended it as a national symbol of dignity in the face of discrimination, her experience becoming a catalyst for reforms that would protect countless others. The parking lot where their paths crossed became hallowed ground in the fight for justice, a place where assumptions met reality and power revealed its true nature. What happened there reminds us that every encounter between citizens and law enforcement is an opportunity to either build trust or destroy it, to uphold justice or perpetuate injustice. And in the end, justice prevailed not because the system worked perfectly, but because one woman refused to be diminished by prejudice and an entire community refused to let misconduct go unchallenged. The truth found its way to the surface, as it always does when people have the courage to seek it and the power to act on it. This story moved you, didn't it? It's a reminder that justice isn't just about courtrooms and laws. It's about ordinary people having the courage to do what's right when it matters most. Make sure to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories like this one. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an update as we continue to uncover tales of courage, accountability, and the triumph of truth over prejudice.